Solum, a new ontology, on the ungrounded condition of coherence, a focused introduction to the ontological foundation of perpetualism. To stand within motion is to endure in coherence. Aeon Timaeus Crux, scope and method, primitives and orientation. What follows is offered as an introduction to perpetualism's foundational project. It is not a work of physics, nor an attempt to revise or replace any scientific theory. The text you are about to read does not seek to explain quantum mechanics, reform general relativity, or solve the technical problem of quantum gravity. Those inquiries remain within disciplines oriented toward empirical description and predictive formalism. Our orientation is different. Perpetualism asks what must already be true of reality for any coherent description, physical, mathematical, or philosophical, to be possible at all. Rather than supplying new equations, it seeks to clarify the commitments that make equations legitimate and worlds intelligible. Its concern is not with how gravity or time happen to behave in this universe, but with what any universe must satisfy in order to endure as a mutually registering whole. To prevent misunderstanding, the accompanying title, Solum, a New Ontology, should be read in precisely this spirit, as the articulation of a standpoint, not as a claim to scientific authority. Quantum mechanics serves as a point of reference regarding legitimacy. QM already teaches, in practice, that observation participates in determination and that stable structures emerge from interaction. We take that lesson as witness and analog, not as a domain perpetualism claims to measure, master, or replace. The system unfolds from what perpetualism calls ontological zero ground, the recognition that no conceptual system can ultimately self-ground without appeal beyond itself. From this recognition, the philosophy develops not a closed doctrine, but an open grammar of manifestation. It proceeds through four mutually implicating primitives: phanesis, manifestation or appearance, the register in which suchness becomes encounterable as isness; relation, the commitment that relation is ontologically prior to substance and intrinsically generative; coherence, the necessary constraint that all accumulated relation remain compatible with itself so that intelligibility can persist; temporis, the irreversible ordering that emerges whenever coherent configurations sediment into histories, becoming measurable as time within descriptive regimes. These primitives are sustained by a single formal operation, the triune recursion, through which interpreter, interpreted domain, and conceptualizability are continually recalibrated together. What maintains this recursion so that it neither ossifies into closure nor disperses into fragmentation is the complementary orientation. Perpetualism designates the crucial equilibrium, the balance in which openness and constraint rehold one another at a sustainable threshold. Accordingly, perpetualism distinguishes two modes of inquiry: the descriptive mode, which maps structures already presumed to exist; the operational mode, which clarifies the conditions that make such mapping possible. Solum inhabits the second alone. The reader is invited to adopt a corresponding posture. Think of the argument not as a hierarchy to be ascended, but as a field to be entered. The subject is the open ground of relation, in which gravity, time, knowledge, and ethics later become legible as derivative descriptions. Physics becomes legitimate because coherence has already been achieved. Locality emerges because compatibility has been registered. And temporis orders what has so registered, as a world with trajectories and consequences. We begin, then, where every science and every philosophy must implicitly begin, whether it recognizes it or not. Openness as condition, coherence as necessity, recursion as operation. 1. The necessity of coherence in generative relationality. Perpetualism begins from a deceptively simple but profoundly demanding commitment. That relation is ontologically primitive and intrinsically generative. Reality is not first composed of self-contained things that only later enter into connections. Rather, connections are the operations through which anything like a thing, a structure, or a stable identity becomes possible. What we encounter as entities are crystallizations within an open relational field. But generativity raises an immediate danger. If relations generate continuously, if each event of engagement modifies the conditions for what may next appear, what prevents reality from unraveling into unregisterable fragments? Pure generation without constraint would produce only scatter, differentiations incapable of sustaining mutual intelligibility or cumulative complexity. A universe in which difference could not be preserved would be a universe in which intelligibility itself could not endure. From this follows the first absolute requirement of any possible reality: coherence. Coherence is not introduced as a value judgment or as a methodological convenience. It is a necessity internal to relational generation. For relations to continue producing new configurations, those configurations must remain compatible with what has already been produced. Without such compatibility, generation would contradict and thereby erase its own conditions of possibility. This minimal ontological constraint we designate coherence. Coherence names what must obtain for the relational field not to collapse into disorder. It is not a law about particular objects, nor a principle restricted to human understanding. It is the structural demand that manifestation remain reconcilable across ongoing relation. Coherence therefore operates at every point of articulation simultaneously, preserving the continuity of intelligible difference. Yet coherence alone would harden into rigidity. If constraint overpowered generativity, reality would freeze into closure. What sustains the living middle between these extremes is the system's second core primitive, the crucial equilibrium, the balance in which openness and constraint perpetually rehold one another so that generation may continue without dissolving or ossifying. Manifestation appears only within this equilibrium. The event of appearance itself, the way suchness becomes consistently encounterable, as isness, we designate phanesis. Phanesis is the register in which coherence becomes phenomenally legible. It is where generative relation shows itself as structured rather than chaotic. Accordingly, perpetualism is defined from the outset by three mutually implicating commitments. Relation generates a generation must satisfy coherence. Coherence and generativity must be maintained in the crucial equilibrium. And the success of that maintenance appears as phanesis. From these follows a further implication that will be formalized later as temporis. The irreversible ordering that emerges whenever accumulation occurs within coherence. Thus, the classical question, what is, gives way to a more primordial one. What must be true of relation for anything to remain at all? The answer is not substance, but coherence. Not a foundation beneath motion, but motion constrained so that constraint itself becomes generative. Solum, the open ground, arises precisely as this unclosed field within which coherence is necessary and generation is possible. 2. Accumulated relation as ontological load. With relational primacy admitted, a second consequence follows inevitably. Relation accumulates. Generative interaction never occurs in a vacuum. Each manifestation registers within the total configuration of what has already cohered. Nothing that has participated in coherence simply vanishes. It persists as modification of the field in which all further participation must take place. Perpetualism names this persistence accumulated relation. Accumulated relation does not mean that reality stores objects like artifacts in a warehouse. It means that every new event reshapes the topology of possibility itself. A fresh relational act alters what may next become conceptualizable, how it may become so, and what positions of interpretation are subsequently available. Accumulation therefore refers to inherited constraint density, not to an inventory of independent entities. What is accumulated is not stuff, but the pattern of coherence already achieved. From this emerges the decisive notion of ontological load. Load in the perpetualist sense is not physical heaviness. Physical weight is a later mathematical translation. Ontological load designates the unavoidable demand placed upon each new configuration to remain coherent with the entirety of prior coherence. To manifest is to confront the requirement of bearing everything that has already manifested. Every system, particle, organism, idea, or institution faces this same demand. Coherence enforces that demand universally, but it does not do so from any deeper or vertical level. The constraint is everywhere at once. The absence of an ultimate foundation is precisely what allows accumulation to continue without ever reaching final closure. Solum remains open so that bearing remains possible. The generative mechanism that handles this load is the triune recursion. Through the triune recursion, each new act of articulation transforms three registers simultaneously. The operator or interpreter is modified. The domain of what can be operated upon expands or contracts, and conceptualizability itself is recalibrated. Because of this triadic transformation, load becomes productive. Accumulation compels recursion, and recursion generates new coherent states that were not previously possible. The very demand for coherence under deepening load is what drives reality forward into richer complexity. Thus, the architecture can be summarized with non-hierarchical precision. Relation generates, generation accumulates. Accumulation produces ontological load. Load must satisfy coherence, and satisfaction occurs only through recursive recalibration within the crucial equilibrium. Solum is the name for this whole architecture, the open ontology in which persistence is achieved by bearing incompleteness rather than by escaping it. What later appears to physics as gravitational form will be shown as one descriptive shadow of this structure, but the ontological grammar itself remains prior to all scientific representation. 3. Locality as a derived consequence of registered coherence. Classical ontologies usually begin by assuming locality. They start with a grid of space, regions already in place, and ask how entities occupy positions within it. Solum begins earlier. If relation is truly ontologically prior, then here and there cannot be primitives. They must be generated outcomes of successful registration within the relational field. Locality, under Solum, is precisely such an outcome. A configuration that satisfies coherence persists as differentiated within the total manifold of accumulated relation. Differentiation is not opposed to coherence. It is what coherence makes sustainably possible. When relations generate in ways that remain mutually compatible, they establish stable patterns of distinction. Those distinctions, once recursively born and reattuned through the crucial equilibrium, become consistently registrable as regions, positions, and separations. What we call locality is the phenomenal legibility of this success. Thus, the perpetualist proposition is stated without compromise: space is not the arena in which registration occurs. Space is what registration looks like once it has occurred coherently. Distance, accordingly, is not fundamental isolation. It is the shadow measure of how much relational mediation is required for difference to remain compatible across the field. Positions emerge wherever identities have achieved a sustainable proportion with their ontological inheritance. Near and far are expressions internal to this topology, not coordinates that precede it. Quantum mechanics serves again as our witness. Entanglement appears non-local because it operates where locality has not yet been sharply achieved. The so-called paradoxes of instantaneous influence at a distance are paradoxes only if we insist that distance is ontologically primitive. Solum instead interprets them diagnostically. Non-locality signals the deeper register of potentiality. where relational determination precedes spatial articulation. Relativity theory, by contrast, formalizes the large-scale checkpoint where locality has become precise enough to sustain causal propagation. Gravity registers as local, not because coherence is local, but because actuality renders coherence in the achieved form of spatial differentiation. The mathematics of curvature expresses the field's capacity to maintain compatibility under load once time and position have become descriptively measurable. Here the role of temporis becomes decisive. Temporis is the irreversible ordering that arises whenever accumulated relations achieve stabilization within openness. Locality is therefore not merely spatial, it is space interpreted through temporis. The manner in which coherent manifestation becomes ordered as a world with histories and trajectories. The achieved universe is layered across such achievements. Potential configurations becoming actual configurations becoming locally legible, and locally legible configurations becoming mathematically describable. But the grammar that makes any of this possible remains constant. Relation, accumulation, and coherence born through recursion. Locality is real, yet it is derivatively real. It is the form that being assumes once difference has stabilized sufficiently to endure. Solum coordinates why space, time, and gravity must appear as they do without asking any one domain to absorb the others. Physics becomes legitimate because locality has been achieved. Locality becomes possible because coherence has been satisfied. And coherence itself is necessary because relation is generative. Ontology, then, does not begin with positions. It begins with the registration of compatibility that produces them. 4. Coda and integration, the return to the open ground. The argument concludes by clarifying what kind of conclusion an open ontology can sustain. Having moved through method, lineage, differentiation, and constraint, we arrive not at a final picture of time or gravity, but at an understanding of why no such final picture can be demanded. Solum names the ground of manifestation as openness. Temporis names the irreversible ordering that appears once openness has already resolved into configuration. Coherence names the structural constraint that makes such resolution possible. Between them, the system does not close, it coordinates. This coordination is itself the demonstration. Traditional ontologies sought a base upon which being might finally rest. Substance beneath change, process as creative advance, or relation between entities. Solum begins by refusing rest. It asserts that any attempt at absolute closure contradicts the conditions under which manifestation endures. What persists only by remaining responsive to what exceeds it. The ground is not something we stand upon once and for all. It is something we stand within as it continually reholds us through motion. Thus, the earlier fragments of ontology are not rejected but resituated. The substantialist intuition captured a genuine feature, the felt solidity of stabilized coherence. Process philosophy captured another, the necessity of continuous recalibration. Relational traditions captured a third, the participatory character of all identity. What Solum adds is the recognition that each of these depends on a more primitive requirement, room to occur. Openness is the invariant topology through which any such requirement becomes satisfiable at all. Physics, when read ontologically, is seen to have been approaching the same insight from another direction. Quantum mechanics formalizes potential. Relativity formalizes actuality. Cosmology formalizes coherence. The moment is the invariant site where these constraints meet. Time measures what is already manifested. Gravity registers the structural load of accumulated relation. Locality emerges as the legible form of that registration. None of this required new equations, only new grammar. The generative mechanism remains exactly what it has always been, the triune recursion. Awareness participates in it, configuration resolves through it, and structure persists because of it. The open ontology, therefore, does not compete with empirical science. It explains why empirical science finds itself compelled to speak in multiple, incompatible ways about a construct, time, that was never the true ontological unit to begin with. The final posture is neither mystical nor dogmatic. To inhabit Solum is to accept the courage of ungrounding, to recognize that certainty is replaced by attunement, authority by responsibility, permanence by resilience. Ethics becomes the discipline of responding within motion. Epistemology becomes the art of participation rather than representation. Ontology becomes topology, mapping how systems remain coherent without requiring a final foundation. This is why this exploration of the framework must end where it began. Not with the last word, but with the recognition that no ontology earns legitimacy by declaring itself finished. Solum earns its legitimacy by showing that manifestation continues only through openness, and that openness continues only through coordination. The ground is open. In openness, being endures.